Perhaps until 20 past we have the hour in.
Great, thank you. I apologise in advance for my throat, nose, cough thing. As Mona said, I just relocated back here. I actually grew up in London and worked as a sign language interpreter for many years, and then went to Australia to do my PhD. I got a scholarship, and I went there for 3 years, and I stayed for 15. So, and I've just come back and taken a position at Heriot-Watt University. So I've literally been here just a few days shy of 4 months. And I think this is the 3rd or 4th cold I've had since I've been here. So obviously my body is trying to tell me something, but I think I'm just fighting off all the British bugs that I have managed to avoid for the last 15 years. And they've been waiting for me to come back. So hopefully it won't interrupt the presentation too much. So just to give you a bit more background about who I am and why I'm called a Chair of Intercultural Communication. As I said, I'm actually a sign language interpreter by profession, so I still practice as a sign language interpreter. And I am multilingual, but not with spoken languages, with sign languages. So I grew up using British Sign Language at home, and then I learned Australian Sign Language and became qualified as an interpreter there. And I also use American Sign Language and a little bit of New Zealand Sign Language, which is very similar to British Sign Language. And I also work as an international sign interpreter, which is a whole other, it's not really a language, it's more of a pidgin that's used by deaf people at international conferences sometimes. But that's a whole other presentation, so I won't talk about that. So I see myself as an expert in interpreting, and my working languages just happen to be between a spoken and a signed language. And often sign language interpreting tends to be pigeonholed. You know, they kind of go, oh, this is translation interpreting studies and that's sign language stuff over there. But that's happening less and less often these days, and I think partly because, not just because of me, but a few other scholars like myself who've been working really hard to cooperate and collaborate with our spoken language colleagues in translation studies and in interpreting studies, and to explore the phenomena of what it is that we do, because so much of what we do is the same, and there are some slight differences, usually based on modality issues, the fact that we use 2 different modalities in our languages, but so many of the issues that we confront are the same. So I'm really excited to come from Macquarie University in Sydney, where I was in a linguistics department, and I used to be head of the translation interpreting program, so I started out running the sign language program and then became responsible for the whole of translation interpreting, and now I'm at Heriot-Watt, where I'm in a languages and intercultural studies department, so we have lots of different languages that we teach and can teach translation and interpreting. And my title for intercultural communication is nice and broad because my research interests are in sign language interpreting, but I'm really particularly interested in communication, interpreter-mediated communication across all languages. And all of my research very much has an applied focus, so it looks at, okay, well, what can we learn about what it is that we do, and then apply that in our practice, but also in our pedagogy, so how we teach interpreting students, and also in policy, so how we can translate what we learn into informing others who provide interpreting services. So my expertise very much is in interpreting rather than in translation. So that's a bit of background of who I am. So when I was asked to talk today, I struggled with this idea of intermediality. So what does that really mean? And so I kind of read around a little bit. And so my presentation is kind of based on my interpretation, if you like, of intermediality as it's relevant to me. So I will be talking generally about interpreting, but I will be focusing today primarily on sign language interpreting, because I think that by talking about sign language interpreting, it actually highlights a lot of issues for us all with any language. So I'm going to be talking about intermediality in terms of interconnectedness. So trying to make connections between spoken and sign languages and in interpreting and in interpreter-mediated communication, but also making connections between, okay, what can we learn about the relationships between the languages that we use, and then the relationships between media and those languages that we use, and therefore how we teach those languages and teach interpreters to work between those languages. So there is a media theme in there somewhere. But first, I didn't want to make any assumptions about what people knew about sign languages and sign language interpreting, so I thought it would be good to go back to basics a little bit and start scratch. And I was really excited actually. Initially I was dreading being the one that was going to go last, because originally Lewis would have been here and I would have been the fourth presenter. But after watching Karen and Geraldine's presentations, I was making frantic notes on my PowerPoint copies here, because I think that my presentation actually draws a lot on what a lot of things that they have both talked about. So I'm hoping that it will kind of bring it all together and make it a nice seamless day for us all. So, but starting from the very beginning, if you like, let's talk about language and what we mean by language. So often when people talk about languages, they talk about spoken languages. There's an assumption that a language is spoken. So if you look at lots of definitions of language, they actually refer to the spoken word and the written word. And the terminology itself is fundamentally phonocentric. So if you actually look at the definition of language and where that word came from, it alludes to use of the tongue. So many people, and so it's not surprising that for many years people said, okay, well, that sign language stuff over there is different. It's not really the same as what we do. And many discussions of languages therefore don't take sign languages into account. They focus very much on those spoken and written languages. So as a result of that, there are common misperceptions about sign languages. People often, and I'd be interested to hear if you've heard of these and have seen or heard of these misperceptions out there, that sign languages are merely manual versions of spoken languages, that a sign will correspond directly to a word, and that the two language modalities operate in a similar grammatical framework, and that there's a temptation to map sign languages directly onto our assumptions about how languages work based on our understanding of how spoken and written languages work. Then we therefore go, okay, well, this is how sign languages work as well, because sign languages are not merely visual representations of words. You cannot directly correspond one word with a sign. And the interesting thing is that with the grammatical framework, a lot of sign languages actually do have a similar grammatical framework, but they're very different from spoken languages. And there is actually more in common with a signed language and another signed language in terms of grammatical structure than there is with a spoken language. But I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. And the interesting thing is that when sign language linguists first started trying to prove that sign languages were languages in their own right and weren't just this, you know, where's the Judah? Oh, did it wrong. Which one is it? No, not that one.
What have you done?
I'm trying to get the pointy thing. Oh, there you go.
It's the
that one.
No, the pointer won't go to a particular slide. It will just move back and forth.
There you go. That's it.
Oh.
When the linguists were trying to prove that sign languages weren't just this manual representation of words, what they did do was map sign languages onto spoken languages. So they used a lot of the terminology that was used to describe spoken languages to say, look, sign languages have classifiers, for example. Sign languages have morphological structures, phonological structures. So they kind of use the terminology of spoken language linguists to say, we have the same things, so they're real languages. So that was the first step, was to prove that they were real languages. And then the next step was then to say, but they're not the same. They're languages within their own right because they have these different, grammatical constructs and so on. So through that kind of research, when they were starting to say, okay, these are languages in their own right, they operate in a different form to spoken languages, then a lot of the assertions made about languages in general and the commonalities of languages in general could be dispelled, because they're saying, well, it doesn't work like that for sign languages. They are languages, but it doesn't happen in quite the same way. So we started to be able to challenge people's assumptions. And more now, people are saying, well, if you're going to talk about languages and language diversity, then you need to consider sign languages in that melting pot of languages, because we can learn, from studying sign languages, we can learn about how language operates anyway, generally. It's not just about, well, this is how sign language works and that's how spoken language works. We can all learn a lot about language and its use in everyday society by exploring all the languages that are available to us. And the interesting thing is now, because of this kind of philosophy, some scholars are starting to talk about, rather than talking about deaf people, because there's a whole movement away from referring to deaf people based on their audiological status and referring to the fact that they're part of a linguistic and cultural minority group. So, for example, the British deaf community would say, well, we associate based on our language and our culture and our shared experience, not just because we're deaf. We have to be deaf in order to have some of that shared experience, but that's not the defining factor. The defining factor is the shared language and culture. So now some people are starting to say, well, wait, maybe we shouldn't be talking about deaf people and deaf communities. Maybe we should be talking about sign language people and sign language users to focus on the language that they use rather than their audiological status. But then that's becomes a political issue then, because I'm a hearing person, someone who can hear. I grew up in the deaf community, so my parents are deaf, my grandparents were deaf, my aunts and uncles, most of the people in my family were deaf, so I was actually a bit of an anomaly in my family. But so I can hear, but could I refer to myself as a sign language user in the same way that a deaf person could refer to themselves as a sign language user? Because I'm not deaf, but I am a native user of sign language. So that's a whole other political discussion, which is again another presentation another time. You have to invite me back, Mona.
Yeah, I will. Count on it.
So I just wanted to kind of, now that I've set that scene, if you like, and just establish where I'm coming from in terms of sign languages, I'd like to explore interconnectedness in languages. So I actually want to now explore, okay, well, what is the relationship between spoken and sign languages? Because there is a connection. And as a sign language interpreter, I work between a spoken and a sign language. And I think it's really complex, but it's really interesting for us to explore some of these issues. So again, just to make sure that we're all on the same page, I'm going to go through some assumptions that we can make about spoken and sign languages. I'm using the term text types here, depending on what theoretical framework you follow. Some people use different terms, but I'm using text types to refer to the different kinds of texts, not necessarily written texts, that can be produced within any given language. Yeah? So when we're talking about spoken languages, the majority of languages, we know that there's usually a spoken form, there's a written form, and more and more now people are talking about the level of gesture. So it came up earlier on, the multimodality that we experience in communicative interaction, so whether that's spoken or written. So if it's spoken, you'll have people who will very specifically use certain gestures, and people will read body language, and there's a whole growing area of linguistic research that's looking at gesture, speech gesture, where it's culturally bound. Different cultures have different gestures which are pertinent and relevant to those cultures, which don't mean the same thing in other communities. And miscommunication can happen quite easily if you get those gestures wrong. I can see people nodding, so I'm sure all of us have been in a situation where you might have misread a gesture or a head nod or a head movement. And multimodality in particular is something which is becoming more popular in applied linguistics research, looking at newspapers and written texts and websites, other forms of written texts which feature not only the words, written words, but also feature pictures or now film as well. So that multimodal form of communication that we're now experiencing in real time, and through this sort of digital revolution that we're experiencing, that more and more information now is multimodal. So if we do think then about sign languages, what sort of text types do we have in sign language? I love that picture. It's not doing a sign, it's just a really nice picture. Usually wakes people up after lunch, I think. So we have the equivalent of the spoken forms, we have the signed forms. So all of our lexical items are produced on the hands, or the majority of them. But we also have meaning in what we produce on the face. So whether you raise or lower your eyebrows, whether you suck in or puff out your cheeks, whether you tilt your head up or down or to the side, all of that is meaningful in sign language. And different sign languages will have different rules about that. We also have things like hand shapes. So hand shapes which are acceptable in any given sign language. And the one I like to use as an example is this one, which is a hand shape in Portuguese sign language, but it's not a hand shape in British Sign Language or Australian Sign Language. And actually for me that's really awkward. It feels really strange for me to do that. But a Portuguese deaf, but like I could, you know, I had to kind of do this, like that, to make my fingers stay on there. It won't even do it. Right? But a Portuguese deaf person could go like that, right? Because for them it's actually it's a phonological feature in their sign language, so therefore they're used to producing that hand shape. So we have rules which govern what handshakes we can use, what facial expressions we could use. And we also use space. So one of the amazing things about sign language is that you can embody information about power dynamics in space. So everything that's placed up, and it kind of represents what we have in a lot of spoken languages too, is that what's up high, placed up high, tends to have more power, or more authority, or more respect than what's down low. So often people will sign, if they're talking about the government, they'll place the government up here and people down here, depending on their particular political point of view perhaps. But so we utilise the space that we have around us, we utilise our body, our face, so all of the physical features that we have are embodied within sign languages. We also embody image and iconicity, gesture, a different form of multimodality. And what I'd like to explore a bit more today is about whether sign language has a written form or not, and how the media and digital technology has impacted upon us producing sign language in a static form. So when we talk about gesture, I've just talked about how different spoken languages have conventional gestures, and what more researchers now are starting to realise is that not only do we have an established lexicon, so we have, you know, a dictionary, you can go and find a dictionary of signs anywhere you want to go, but we also have a creative lexicon. So in sign languages, you have, because you can use the space around you, you have the facility to play with language that you can, to I think an extent, in spoken languages, and I don't know enough spoken languages to be able to directly compare, but you have the facility to extend what lexical signs exist. So I'll give you an example. This is the sign for confident. Yeah, so going from down here, it's metaphorical. Yeah, so it's coming from, you know, you're feeling low, and then this is a C, the letter C. So it comes up here. So it's a confident person. You know, you have good self-esteem. Okay, but I've seen deaf people play with this sign, and they talk about someone having no confidence at all. They go like this. Right? So their confidence is so low, it's like out of their body and it's rolled away. Right? Or their confidence is so high, it's like this. Right? So you have that facility to do that, but did you see what I was doing with my face? All of that is really important. If I'd gone like this, it doesn't have the same meaning. Or if I'd gone, it doesn't mean the same thing. So we have so much facility there within the sign languages that we use. And sign language linguists are also starting to do more research to try and tease out where gesture also forms a part of sign languages. Because for a long time, we tried so hard as sign language linguists to say, no, it's not gesture. Sign languages are real languages in their own right. It's not just, you know, mimetic gesture. But now they're kind of coming back to saying, well, actually, just like with any language, there's an element of gesture. So when a person who's a sign language user is communicating with another sign language user, they might well have gestures in there that are used by the wider community. So if you live in Italy, for example, and you're a deaf Italian, you would probably incorporate some of the normed gestures that are used by the wider hearing majority in Italy into your sign language. So what some sign linguists are saying is this is a form of multimodality in sign languages, because they're incorporating a different mode of communication, another non-verbal mode of communication into their language. And again, different deaf people would be only using the gestures which are appropriate within their cultural framework. So whether it's Italy, Spain, China, Greece, Britain, wherever. So let's think a bit about image and iconicity in sign languages. Because again, it's something else that we can exploit. We use a lot of visual metaphor, so I just showed you an example with the sign confident. We use spatial metaphor, so I talked about the authority and how we use, some people call it placement, but you can place abstract concepts in space. So I can talk about Geraldine being over there, okay, and I can point to her and she's over there and she's real, you can see her sitting there. But imagine Geraldine wasn't here. Imagine she'd popped to the loo or had gone to get her train. I could actually say, oh, you know Geraldine, and I could place her right there. And so she's not actually here, but I could refer to her in space. Or I could say, you know Geraldine, like this, and I could actually refer to the place where she was sitting but is no longer, and you would know who I was talking about. And you can also see that I'm showing you that she was sitting over in that corner, facing that direction, because these are her legs. Yeah. So I'm representing her legs. If she wasn't standing, she was sitting. Or she could even be, if she was really tired, she may have been lying on the floor. But, you know. So we can actually embody all of that information into sign languages in an iconic way. So, and the interesting thing is that some people assume that all signs are iconic, that they should be representational. Some of them are, but some of them aren't. So I've given you a basic example here of metonymy, another word that I hate to say, which is a metaphoric representation of what it looks like, what something looks like. So a tree. So in most sign languages, something like this would be the sign for tree. Kind of looks like a tree, right? You've got the trunk and you've got the branches. This is a tree. Okay, what do you think this is the sign for? Baby. Okay, what do you think this is the sign for? Tattoo. Not bad, not bad. What am I drawing on my shoulder? Cross. So what do you think that represents? Yeah.
A what?
Nurse.
Nurse.
Old
that's
sign.
very culture specific.
Yeah, it is, exactly. So this is a British sign. An old sign for nurse used to be this. Because they used to wear these bonnets with the things under their heads. Okay. So you can see that there is a level of iconicity, of direct representation of what we sign with what we see. But there are also many signs that have no relationship whatsoever. And of course I'm trying to think of an example now and I can't think of one. But again, it's about showing that the sign languages are more complex than just saying, okay, well, they're a visual gestural system. They're more than that. They're a visual language. We use this visual modality and we can exploit that modality, but it's actually very complex. Sign names is a good example. Have any of you ever heard of sign names? So sign names, you know, so when you're born, you're given a name, okay? It's written down in your language. You're told how to pronounce it once you're old enough to speak. For deaf people in the deaf community are also given a sign name. So when they're born, they're given an orthographic name, so they're given something on their birth certificate and they know how they're supposed to say their name, or they know how to spell their name. So my name is Jemina, so it's Jemina. Okay? My sign name is this. Because deaf people are given a sign name, usually you're given a sign name by the community. You don't get to choose your own sign name, you get given it by someone in the community. And either it's a sign name, a descriptive sign name, so it describes something about the way you look or a particular behaviour you have that's obvious. So, for example, your sign name could be something like this. You know, if you wear glasses, if you have curly hair, if you have a tic of some kind. People will observe your behaviours or your physical features and can give you a sign name. Or there's a story behind your name. It's more abstract. So when you look at me and I show you my sign name, is there any descriptive feature about me that you think would lead to this sign name?
But do you confuse it with the gestures of used in this? Because this is a little bit like, it's something like either mind your own business.
Yeah,
or,
right, okay.
Something
so yeah, in some cultures maybe they'd be like, mind your own business, or it's a secret.
Yeah.
I was inquisitive, maybe. It's actually to do with my name, because my name is Jemina, not Jemima, and lots of people think it's Jemima, and it's a misspelling. So I always have to correct people and say, no, my name's Jemina, not Jemima. And so the person who gave me that sign name used to work as a teacher with deaf children, and said that when they were taught how to teach deaf children how to speak, they had all these manual visual codes to show the kids so they knew how to emphasise certain sounds, and this was the sound, this is the sign for n. So when the teacher signed this, the children knew they had to say n. So there's a story behind my sign name. And I have to explain. But when I first moved to Australia, they thought it was because I was posh. Because this is one sign for posh in Australian Sign Language. So I preferred that explanation, actually. So there's the kind of core constructs, if you like, around sign languages. So, but what I'm really interested in exploring, given the context of where we are today, talking about translation and the media. So, does sign language have a written form? Can we write it down? Now, generally people say no, sign languages don't have a written form. And I think that one of the interesting things is that when people have historically talked about deaf culture and deaf communities, they've talked about deaf communities as being oral cultures. Ironically, oral culture is the only term that seems to fit. But the cultures that they don't write their stuff down. So they're storytelling cultures where they pass down their stories from generation to generation. And Karen talked about Michael Cronin saying how a translation is carried down through societies over time. And so that is reminiscent of those oral cultures about what can be carried on over time. So for deaf communities and sign language using communities, there is no written form of a signed language. So they've traditionally been thought of as oral cultures. So lots of information is passed down from generation to generation through storytelling. And the only way that you could capture sign languages was with this some kind of static illustration like that. So either a photograph or a written picture with arrows to try and depict the movement, because that's the one major thing that's missing from the picture is the movement. I showed you the example of the sign confident. In a picture, you'd either catch the sign either being here, or here, or here, or here, and you probably had little arrows kind of going up or down. But it doesn't really, so people trying to learn or trying to refer to these kinds of documents, you can see them kind of going, because they can't get the whole picture, and also it doesn't tell you what's going to happen on the face either. This is an example of one type of illustration, if you like. But what I'm going to talk about now are a couple of other sort of written systems for sign languages in terms of glossing and notation systems. Glossing is something that's been made popular by researchers in particular, sign language researchers, sign language linguists, and this is actually an extract from my PhD. And it's funny because I went searching for it because it's been such a long time, and I was like, why did I choose to do it like that? But anyway, so with glossing, what you tend to do is use capitalised words to represent and choose a word that as closely as possible represents the sign that's being used. Okay, and there are certain conventions that are generally accepted. So, but what you would do is when you do the glossing is you follow the grammatical structure of the signs. So here's the English, this is the original English source text. So this is a glossing of a piece of interpretation from English into Australian Sign Language. This is the original English source text here, this sentence. And what they did was contrast the acquisition of these features with the acquisition of the same types of grammatical features. And you can see my glossing starts here. So this is where the interpreter started to sign. So this is a representation of the lag time, if you like, how long it took for the interpreter to actually start signing. And then here, each gloss represents what was actually signed. Sometimes you actually need to use more than one English word to represent one sign. And when that happens, you tend to use a hyphen to attach several words together. So if, for example, the interpreter signed this, then I might gloss that by putting very, very confident, and then attach very, very confident together with hyphens so that you can see it's actually one sign, but I had to use several words to represent. So it's a form of translation. This is a representation of finger spelling. So when I finger spell my name, this shows that the interpreter spelled out this word. Yeah? And then depending on the level of complexity that you need, you can also add other information. So here, what I was trying to do was show what other features the interpreter was using apart from just the lexical signs they were producing. So here, this was a convention I used for head nod. This was when they were using placement, so they were setting things up on the left or the right. And this one was a reference, so where they said, what research? They said, what, as in the research that's out there. That was a reference. So this was a system that people were using, started using for quite some time in order to try and document what they could see in a sign language so they could analyse it and then talk about it in a scholarly way. So talk about it and publish it, because until we had the kind of technologies that we have now, there was no way to really capture what it was that people were doing. So this was a sort of an intermediary system that people came up with. This is a couple of examples of other systems which some linguists tried to come up with and have pretty much been shunned by deaf people. This is called the Hamnosis, the Hamburg notation system, and this is the sign writing system. I don't know if you can really see it, but the sign writing system is trying to show, there's a circle, is the person, and it's trying to show like the direction that the hand goes in. And so it's basically, it's like little mini pictures. And you're supposed to be able to read that and interpret that into signs and know what signs to use. And likewise with this Hamnosis system, this figure here shows that it's that hand shape. This one here shows that it's this hand shape with two fingers. Yeah? And it's supposed to be able to show you whether to do the sign that, like that, like that, like that, that way, the orientation and the movement. This hand shape here is that. But it's actually really complex and really hard to learn, and linguists have found it useful to a point, but we're finding now that less and less linguists are using these systems because they're so complex to actually learn and get your head around that you're constantly having to refer back to your reference lists to go, what was that hand shape? What was that symbol for again? It's too time consuming. So nobody's really using them anymore. So they're kind of notional written forms of sign languages. And what I'm going to go on and talk about in a moment is the interconnectedness between sign languages, written forms or static forms, and the media. But one of the things that's always fascinated me about working with between the sign language and the spoken language is that interconnectedness between the modalities. Because even though we can say spoken languages have different grammatical structures, different vocabularies, different lexicon, depending on which part of the world you're in, sign languages have different grammatical structures, different lexicon, and so on and so forth, there is a relationship. There is a relationship between the spoken language of any given country and the sign language of any given country. There's a form of language contact. And I heard, Phil, you were saying you did your PhD research on language contact, right? Between
German and Czech.
German and Czech. Okay, I know nothing about German and Czech, but you know then that, so language contact is about the transference of some linguistic features from one language into another, or vice versa. And there are different layers, if you like, of language contact that can happen. So we see that many bilinguals will code switch. So for those of you who are here, you probably have found yourself doing it depending on who you're talking to. You can either do it intersententially or intrasententially. So you can start a sentence in one language and finish it in another. Or sometimes you might even switch languages in the middle of a sentence and switch back again. It might just be one word that you use. And I think Karen gave the example earlier on of the translation where the pretty woman was inserted.
Oh, yeah.
So that's a good example of language, intrasentential language contact, because there was bringing in just two English words into that German sentence. And this is very common, especially among bilinguals. But the interesting thing for sign language users is that deaf people use sign languages to communicate. But, So, for example, for British deaf people, they need to use sign language to communicate, but they still need to have a level of competency, a level of literacy in English, because that's how we function in British society. So everything, print media is all in English, you know, television programs are all in English, so therefore the captioning that's provided for deaf people is in English. So what happens is that deaf people have to have a level of bilinguality. They have to have, and some people are more bilingual than others. Yeah, so they might be more confident in using English than others. But for every deaf person, they have to have some exposure to spoken and written languages. And so what we see is this interconnectedness between, I'm using the example of English and British Sign Language. So we'll see, for example, that a bilingual like me, my husband's also a bilingual hearing person who grew up using sign language at home. So we will often switch between English and British Sign Language. We'll switch between when we're in conversation with each other. But one thing that we can also do is code blend. We can code or code mix. We can speak and sign at the same time. So sometimes I'll start talking and then I'll also start signing, because some of the signs we use do map onto English words. So it's actually possible for us to do that at the same time. And so, for example, when my daughter was born, we said we wanted her to be bilingual because although she could hear, all of her grandparents are deaf, it was really important for us to be able to communicate. But it was really hard to sign at home with her because we can both hear. So it's not natural for us to sit there and sign to each other without using our voices, because we're actually hearing people. So what we decided to do was to sign and speak with her, to code blend while she was very young, so that at least she was having exposure to signs all the time. And as she's got older and has had more exposure with deaf people and deaf family members and stuff, it's become easier to go, okay, this is English and this is British Sign Language, and she's now bilingual, she uses both of them. And that was a kind of strategy that we could adopt to make sure that we at least had sign language at home while she was around, so that she was exposed to it early on. And so what we find that the contact that you see is that you get borrowings from English into British Sign Language. So you actually get, so when you look at any deaf person signing, you see, when you look at their mouth, there are some mouthings which are grammatical to sign language. So like I said, you know, the puffing of the cheeks or the sucking in of your cheeks. There's also certain mouthings which are very specific. So I'll give you an example of one Australian sign. But. Right? And you don't, and it means kind of odd, bizarre. So a deaf person would say, oh, you know, that, sorry to pick on you, that jumper's a bit odd, or that jumper's a bit bizarre. Then they might say, they'd say, but. And that mouthing is very specific. They wouldn't say, that's bizarre. They would say, but. But the rest of the time, often you'll see on the mouth corresponds with spoken English. So you would see English mouthing. Yeah? Let me just give you an example. Just see if you can figure out what I'm saying. No, two sign language people here, you can't say anything.
Jemina.
Yeah?
What's the last bit?
Get the last bit, and I work at Heriot-Watt University. Right. So, but you see what was happening on my mouth? Yeah? So there is a correspondence. So even though sign languages are grammatically separate from spoken languages, there is a correspondence. So when you go to Italy, an Italian deaf person will have Italian on their mouth. Spain, Spanish on their mouth, and so on. So there is a correspondence. So we've worked really, really hard to say, no, sign languages are different, and they are different, but there is a relationship to the spoken language that they're surrounded by. There has to be, just because deaf people have to interact with that majority language all the time. But the interesting thing too is that we do see language contact happening between signed and written languages, especially those written languages that use characters. So Chinese, Japanese, this is a Taiwanese sign language, and written Chinese. This research showed that deaf sign language users were incorporating some Chinese character symbols into their sign language. So for example, in China, this is the sign for China, which I believe is very similar to the written symbol for China, right? Okay. Everywhere else, we sign China. Can you guess what it represents? Mao's jacket that he used to wear, the design of the jacket. So most people, that's an internationally recognised sign for China, but Chinese people actually sign China. Yeah. So you're seeing a form of language contact here happen between signed and written languages, and also between two signed languages. A guy called Robert Adams just finished his PhD looking at the language contact between British Sign Language and Irish Sign Language in Australia, because Australian Sign Language is very closely related to British and Irish Sign Languages, and he's traced it back to the fact that the people who established the first deaf schools in Australia came from Ireland and Britain. So the teachers introduced their sign languages, i.e. Irish and British Sign Languages, and then they became this big melting pot, and Australian Sign Language now exists, so there's lots of close relationship between those sign languages. So see what I mean, where I'm coming from when I'm talking about interconnectedness? You know, that even though we're talking about different languages and different modalities, there are very strong connections. Keep on time.
You're okay.
So as a sign language interpreter, I work bimodally. So I'm working between two modalities. Most spoken language interpreters would be considered to be working unimodally, because you're only working in one modality. And some people think that because of the two modalities, that puts extra burden on us, especially because we tend to work simultaneously as interpreters in sign languages because we can, because one of our languages is silent. So it's easier to work simultaneously, even though more and more people are starting to say, well, we should be using consecutive in some situations, especially when there's sensitive information. It might actually lead to more accuracy if you work in a consecutive mode, but generally we tend to work simultaneously. And Tracy and Trudy, you can throw anything at me if you think I'm the same thing.
I totally agree with that.
But we're also seeing that sign language interpreters, some of the research has shown that interpreters are as participants. So Cecilia Vardenshaw looked at spoken language interpreters working between Swedish and Russian, and Cynthia Roy looked at an American sign language interpreter, and then later Melanie Metzger. But they have all found that interpreters are visible. You know, they are very much present in an interaction when they're mediating communication. Interpreters are very much present, and Cynthia Roy in particular found that sign language interpreters were able to harness the fact that they're using two different languages in two different modes to help facilitate the communication, so they could use some gestures. So for example, Cynthia Roy's work, she looked at a university professor and a deaf PhD student having a meeting to talk about, they were negotiating about him submitting an assignment, and he was asking for an extension on a written piece of work. And the interpreter, she drew on interactional sociolinguistics as a theoretical framework, and she was saying that the interpreter was making judgments around what was culturally appropriate and was guiding the communication so that there was no communication breakdown, that everyone was, you know, saving face, you know, was considering all the politeness that was happening. And a couple of times the deaf PhD student tried to interrupt the professor, and the interpreter was still interpreting what the professor was saying and kind of went and carried on. Just a really quick gesture. I wouldn't do that if I were you. And carried, you know, and carried on. I mean, there's a whole other debate you can have about whether that was appropriate or not, but the issue is around managing. We have that facility, the bimodality, to use. We can use our bimodality to facilitate communication and enhance the communication. And I was interested in one of the things that Karen said earlier on about memory, and you showed those great pictures of memory, because it made me think about this. One of my PhD students who just recently finished, she's waiting for her examiner's reports, and she looked at working memory in sign language interpreters. And I had assumed that deaf people and sign language interpreters would remember signs visually because it's a visual language and so on. But what she's found, we did an Auslan working memory test. So we replicated working memory tests from different psychological literature that have been established and used before, and we adapted them. So we made one Auslan working memory test and an English working memory test, and we asked a group of deaf people to do the Auslan working memory test, the sign language memory test. Then we got the interpreters to do the same one, and then we also got the interpreters to do some interpreting tasks, and we were trying to see that if they had stronger working memory in one language or another, did that have any relationship to their language direction, the accuracy in which language direction they were working in. And basically what we found was that both the deaf people and the sign language interpreters would give English words to the signs that they saw. So when we were asking them to recount the signs that they had seen, what was happening, we knew that they were sort of translating between English and Auslan, because what was happening is they would sometimes produce a different sign. So say, for example, in Australia, there's this sign for dinner. Yeah. There's also this sign for dinner. Yeah. So in our test, we had this sign for dinner. But when we asked the interpreters to recount, and the deaf people to recount what they remembered, some of them used this sign for dinner. So they hadn't remembered the sign, they'd remembered the word, the English word, and they just chose to produce the sign which is most familiar to them. So, which I found fascinating. It's like, wow, in terms of their memory, they're working, and for us as interpreters, our working memory, they're already doing a level of translation. And they were also using a lot of gesture. So when we would give them batteries of signs to remember, so there'll be 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or 7. And the longer the lists got, they were using gesture, they were counting on their fingers to help them remember, or they were doing things like, there was usually some kind of physical thing that was helping them remember, which I just thought, so again there's kind of that interconnectedness between signed and spoken languages, that even though we were asking them to do a sign language working memory test, they were still thinking to some extent in English. They still had English in there and they were operating between both languages. And this is where I'm really interested in this area, so I was particularly interested in Geraldine's presentation about how theatre, being a site for the study of translation, but can also be the site of study for sign language interpreting in particular, because we work in theatre context, and I could give you a whole workshop just on that, that there's a hybrid that's happening there, because what you've got, and I was really interested in what you were saying about whether it's adaptation, translation, because for sign language interpreters, the process is, and I'm talking about the Australian context, so it might not be exactly the same here, but it would be similar. But usually you'd have 2 interpreters and a consultant. So somebody usually that was deaf or had a theatre background or had been interpreting a lot in theatre, who could kind of look at your choreography and your translation and would work with you. So what would happen is the interpreters would get a script, often will get a video of the production. They would go and watch the production a couple of times. They would work through it. They would allocate characters. So they'd say, okay, right, well, I'll do all of the men and you do all the women, or I'll do, Stella and you do what's his face in Streetcar Named Desire. And what is his name?
Marlon Brando.
That would do, Marlon. And then you allocate characters, and then you work out a rough translation, and then you come back together and you go through it and you practice. You revise the translation, you show it to the consultant who gives you feedback, you revise the translation again, and you go, and I was interested in what you were talking about, Geraldine, the speakability, the comprehension, the genre and the tonal approach. Exactly the same. Speakability for a sign language, because what happens is you prepare this translation, but when you actually execute it, you're doing it live, on stage, one performance, one time, usually just one time. So you can do all of this translation, you can do all this preparation, and on the night, you have no idea what's going to happen. The actor can fluff their lines, they can ad-lib, you can forget what you prepared as a translation, because you're producing a live, spontaneous interpretation, which is why we can consider it as being a hybrid, because you're going through a translation process, but the end product is not a static, translated script or text, it's a production. And it's really a real fine line between us as interpreters, being interpreters and being performers. Because you're up on the stage and you're signing the words, and you have to kind of embody the characters to a degree, but not so much that the deaf people just want to look at you all the time. They still need to try and look at the actors, because the actors are the ones who are acting. The theatre practitioners are the ones who are actually delivering the play. You're just making it accessible. And so you have to make sure that it's the speakability, so that you can deliver your interpretation of the lines at the same pace that the actors are delivering it. So if you're trying to make cultural adaptations, there's no point doing that if it means you're going to take twice as long to produce a signed sentence as compared to, because you need to be on time. So when the audience laughs, the deaf people laugh. The hearing audience laughs, the deaf people laugh. You've got to time, so you've got to actually think about the timing of the delivery as well. And the comprehension is about, well, are deaf people understanding what's going on? Are they getting that this is funny? Are they getting how serious this is? Are they wanting to cry like the same as everybody else? You have to try and match that affect all the way through. And so sign language interpreting in the theatre is one area which is really under-researched. The sign language translation is a kind of an emerging area which we're starting to look at a lot more, and there's an element of multimodality in that, and again it refers back to what Karen was talking about, that you can draw on all of these different things. And Svenja Wurm, who works with me at Heriot Watt, did her PhD on sign language translation, and she did an ethnographic case study of one sign language translator basically translating a chapter from an academic textbook and producing it on DVD for a group of deaf postgraduate students. And what Svenja found was that the translator had a multimodal environment. So she had the original textbook, she had flip chart paper all the way around the room that she had drawn on, she had photos, she had pictures, she had a video camera, she filmed herself doing drafts earlier, which she then referred back to. So this is a multimodal process. So in some ways you could say that perhaps we're working trimodally, because for us sometimes we're working between a written language, spoken language and sign language. And this is one example I want to show you before I run out of time. This is an example of a really great project which did operate across 3 languages and 3 modalities. And it was a project, this is Ella Leith, who's currently doing her PhD at Edinburgh University, and she presented this study as part of her major review after her first year. But she was involved in a project where some translations of narratives told in Scots were translated into British Sign Language. So this is the Scottish Centre for Scottish Storytelling Archives, or something it's called, in Edinburgh University. So they've had this huge project to collect all these stories from elderly Scots people telling stories, these kind of fables and old Scots stories in Scots. Right. Does anyone know what Scots is? Right. Of course you do, yeah. Okay, again, you're biased. Right, so there's Scots, some people would say it's English, but it's the Scots version of English, and it's actually very hard to understand if you meet someone who speaks very fast and very broad Scots. They're actually quite hard to follow, I'm sure you would agree.
Oh yeah.
So this project involved translating a story, and several stories, but I'm just going to show you one example, from Scots into British Sign Language. But what happened was they brought a deaf translator on board who didn't understand Scots. So the Scots was originally told, he was this guy Stanley Robertson, who was actually a very well-known Scots storyteller, yeah. He was filmed telling the story orally, which was then transcribed, so it was then written down. They then had to translate that into plain English, so that the deaf guy, I think his name's Frankie, could then translate from the English into British Sign Language. And I'm going to show you a clip. Now, before we start, I'll just stop that for a second. So you'll see here, what you're going to see is him initially sign this bit, a translation of this bit. So what the name of the story is, who it's told by, and with thanks to TOCA, the School of Scottish Studies Archives. There you go, that's the name I was looking for, at the University of Edinburgh. So you'll see him sign this bit first, and then you'll see a quick photo of Stanley Robertson, the storyteller, and then Frankie will start signing the story in Scots. So I don't know if you can see, I'll just try and... I'm not even going to try and read it out because there's no way I can read it out. But if you actually look at it, you can see it is English, but just the way that it's actually written phonetically to represent the way that it sounds in Scots. Okay. I'm not going to show you all of it because the whole thing's nearly 10 minutes long. I'm just going to show you the first minute or so. And I want you to watch Frankie when he's signing, because when he's doing the introductory bit saying this is a story by Stanley Robertson, etc., etc., this bit, and then it stops, you see the photo and he comes back on. Look at the difference in his signing style. Just look at the, and I just want to see anything in particular that you observe about the way that he signs. Okay, so that was just a little intro. This is what the story is, blah, blah, blah. That's Stanley Robertson. Can you see the devil? I'm going to have to, I'll stop it there just because otherwise I need to finish off. But could you see a difference between the way that he was signing? Can you see a difference?
From what?
From the beginning, the introductory bit, to when he started telling his story.
When he was mousing, his body moved much more.
Yeah, his body moved more.
Well, at the beginning he was mousing once, and then he stopped.
So interesting. So when he was doing, the first bit was more formal, and it was just kind of, he was, you know, and this is a blah, 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 blah. And then as soon as he went into the storytelling mode, you can see he was really trying to represent the Scots-like form of the story. It was a story, it was a narrative, it was more informal. He was personifying the characters in the story. And if you watch it all the way through, you see that he's the devil, and then he's the woman, and then he's the devil, and then he's the woman. But what really struck me about it was the fact that if you read, if we had more time, you could, if you read the Scots, or if I could had someone to read it out for me, you can see, like, if that was just a sign language translation of an English narrative, he would have a lot of the similar features in sort of the more informal, casual storytelling style. But I think there was an extra element there where he was trying to represent the Scots nature of the way that it was delivered originally in the Scots, and the fact that when he chose to pause and how he chose to pause to try and represent some of those tonal aspects that you were talking about, Geraldine, which is fascinating. So this is like, you know, a tri-modal translation. Right, I'm going to finish off really quickly by talking about interconnectedness and media. That kind of project that I just showed you has been made possible by the digital revolution. So now we have, you know, deaf people can write to each other by uploading videos on Facebook. They can use YouTube. You can actually create signed text because it's really quickly, really easy with the video camera to quickly film yourself, do a little edit, and then upload something somewhere. So this notion of a written form of a sign language has shifted, because before you couldn't, the technology just wasn't available to us. So there's early movies of a deaf guy called Veditz back in, I think it was the late 1800s, signing in America. It's like an old black and white, reel-to-reel movie that somebody found as like a huge reel. But until we had this kind of digital era of videos, people couldn't edit their own stuff. You couldn't go into an editorial suite and, like you were, the representations you were talking about with the photo film, you know, all over the floor. That doesn't happen. It doesn't need to happen. You know, you don't have to go that route. So what we're seeing now is that with all these advances in technology, is deaf people, sign language is everywhere. Deaf people can communicate with each other, we can produce translations, we can actually embrace the media, and I think, well not can, we are embracing the media in our everyday lives as sign language users, but also in sign language translation and sign language interpreting. So there are more online resources, there are avatars, there's websites, and there's software, which I'll talk about in a moment. This is a project I was involved in. You're seeing a lot more of this kind of thing, where people are trying to create online resources, where they're creating sign banks, lexical sign banks, but that people can contribute to. That's a community participation, where people can actually say, well, I know of other signs, and they can film themselves and upload them, which wasn't possible before. People now, avatars have always been around, and deaf community have always been very sceptical about them, but the technology is becoming more sophisticated. So for really, really basic things, I saw a paper about avatars that were created to use in post offices. So you could go in, and if a person said, okay, I'm deaf, the person at the counter would press a button, and a little avatar would say, hello, how can I help you? You know? And then they'd have all these list of options, and the deaf person would pick one, and then they'd click on the thing and say, that would be 50p, please. You know, just for really basic transactions, sign language avatars are being used, and again, it's enabled through technology. We have website accessibility, so more and more website translations are happening, which is why sign language translation is a growing art form, if you like. Before, people used to say, oh, we don't do translation because that's text to text. We only work between, you know, through the air languages, and we only interpret. Whereas now, what's happening is people are producing sign language translations which will be preserved. So that's a new form of text that we are creating because of the media, because of the digital revolution. And this, is anyone here familiar with Elan? I love it, absolutely love it. If you don't use it, you have to use it. It's free, download it. It's actually was invented by the Max Planck Institute for Psycholinguistics to use initially with spoken language research and to look at gesture, co-speech gesture. Now, pretty much every sign language researcher I know uses it, and we're using it in interpreting research. And we also use it in interpreting pedagogy, where you can upload video clips. You can use audio clips too, but you can create tiers to annotate. So I use it for video, for interviews, for research, when I do interviews to do thematic analysis. Or here, you can't actually see the level of detail, but you can create tiers, so you could do, you know, eyebrow movement, shoulder movement, mouth movement. You could actually get to such a small level of detail where you can annotate exactly what's happening. And earlier on we were talking about speed, technology and speed. With Elan you can slow it down. So you can slow it down so much that for when deaf people are finger spelling, for example, sometimes it's so fast it's really hard to capture it. And you can slow it right down so you can see people going, and you can see which finger they're pointing to, so you know whether it's an E or an I and things like that. So for sign language researchers, this is a phenomenal piece of software which has made a huge difference to our lives. So the glossing and the notation systems and the writing systems I've shown you, gone, because we now use this, and it's free. You just type into Google Elan, and it takes you to the language archives at the Max Planck Institute, and it's really easy to use. I'm not very tech savvy, it's really easy to use. So the impact of intermediality, the fact that we can embrace the media, I think, has, and I was going to refer to Lewis's presentation if he'd been talking about subtitling practice, because I think things like the iPad and other forms of media have impacted on our interpreting practice. When I work at conferences now, I turn up with my iPad, and all the other interpreters in the team have iPads with all copies of all of the presenters' papers on, and then if we get new presenters' papers, they put it in a Dropbox, and then I have it, and we have it on our iPad, and we show, and we use that as a tool. And we're now using it. I just finished a project in Australia using iPads to teach conference interpreting students. So we had a group of Chinese conference interpreting students who were using iPads to source apps to assist with their language development, assist with their interpreting skills development. So the media is making a huge impact, and we use ELAN. We get students to film themselves and then use ELAN to do self-critique of their own interpreting practice. And now I've just arrived at Heriot-Watt. We have a program which is a British Sign Language. We have a British Sign Language stream. So in our undergraduate program, our language is an interpreting program. We have German, French, Spanish, Arabic, Chinese, and now British Sign Language. So some of our students can choose to elect 2 languages. So they might do BSL and French, or BSL and German. So one of my goals now that I'm here is to introduce ELAN in the pedagogy in the department, because I know that it's not actually being used at the moment. And I think it should be, because it's a great tool for us as teachers and for students, because the students can work on stuff at home. It's really easy to use, it's portable, they don't have to be in the lab, they can use it on their laptops, and anyone can use it really easily. And I should stop there, sorry, I've really gone over my time.
No, it's all right.
And,
eat into my time as much as I'm only going to improvise. You've been warned.
So I suppose in summary, what I was trying to get at was that, you know, I'd like to see more collaboration between sign and spoken language interpreting researchers. I think that now that we have these kind of media technologies available to us, and we know that there is this interconnectedness between what we do and our languages, that there's so much more capacity for collaboration and cooperation, and to really explore how we can utilise the media that's available to us in teaching interpreting students. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Okay, we do have time for questions. So.